The moment I set foot in my childhood home, something felt wrong. The air hung heavy with a peculiar staleness that transcended mere abandonment. After my mother's passing, the responsibility of clearing out the old Victorian house had fallen on me alone. I thought I'd be confronted only by dusty furniture and forgotten memories. I was mistaken. The attic was my final frontier. Decades of family history compressed into cardboard boxes and forgotten trunks. As afternoon light filtered through the single circular window, dust particles danced in the beam like microscopic spectators. That's when I found it, tucked between two photo albums from the 1950s. A portrait, roughly 8 by 10 inches, in an ornate silver frame that seemed too elaborate for the image it contained. The portrait depicted a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9, wearing clothes that suggested the early 1900s. His posture was unnaturally stiff, his smile peculiarly vacant. What struck me most were his eyes, dark, almost hollow, yet somehow penetrating. I had never seen him before, which was strange considering my mother's meticulous cataloging of our family history. When I turned the frame over, I found nothing. No name, no date, no indication of who this child might have been. Something about the portrait compelled me to hang it in the upstairs hallway. I told myself it was out of respect for whatever forgotten relative this might be, but in truth, those eyes had captivated me in a way I couldn't articulate. That night, sleep evaded me. The house creaked and settled in ways I didn't remember from childhood. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, the unmistakable sound of small footsteps crossing the floor above my bedroom. My rational mind suggested mice, or perhaps the house shifting in the autumn cold, yet my body responded with primal fear, a cold sweat breaking across my forehead, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I told myself I would remove the portrait in the morning, but morning came, and in the bright light of day, my fears seemed absurd. The portrait was just a portrait. The footsteps were just the house settling. I decided to stay another night. The second night passed without incident, almost disappointingly ordinary. By the third day, I had nearly forgotten my initial unease. I was carrying a box down the hallway when I noticed something that stopped me cold. The boy's smile in the portrait had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably different. The vacant expression had transformed into something knowing, almost smug. I approached the portrait slowly, my mouth suddenly dry. The closer I got, the more normal it appeared. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, or perhaps my mind playing tricks after days of sorting through emotionally laden possessions. That night, I awoke to the sound of humming, a children's melody I vaguely recognized but couldn't name. It came from the hallway. My body refused to move, paralyzed not by any supernatural force, but by my own terror. My breathing became shallow and rapid, and I felt lightheaded as the humming grew closer to my bedroom door. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. The next morning, I noticed small fingerprints on the dusty banister, too small to be mine. I told myself they were old, perhaps left there months ago during my mother's final days when visitors came and went. Yet deep down, I knew they were fresh. I began to avoid the hallway where the portrait hung. When I absolutely had to pass it, I kept my eyes fixed on the floor. But even without looking, I could feel the boy's gaze tracking me, his smile widening incrementally with each passage. My peripheral vision seemed to catch slight movements within the frame, a tilting of the head, a shifting of posture. I contacted the local historical society about the portrait. They had no record of the boy but mentioned that early photography often required subjects to hold poses for extended periods, resulting in unnatural expressions. The explanation was rational, scientific. It should have comforted me. It didn't. By the fifth night, I had developed a persistent sensation of being watched. The back of my neck tingled constantly. I lost my appetite. Sleep came in short, restless bursts. When I did sleep, I dreamed of endless corridors lined with identical portraits, each one watching me with the same dark, hollow eyes. I decided to end this. I took the portrait from the wall, wrapped it in brown paper, and drove it to a secondhand store 20 miles away. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in nearly a week, but my relief was short-lived. Upon returning home the following afternoon, I found the portrait back in its place on the hallway wall. The paper wrapping lay neatly folded on the floor beneath it. The boy's smile was now unmistakably a grin, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. I'm writing this now from a hotel room 30 miles from my childhood home. Tomorrow I'll return with a friend, safety in numbers, to finish clearing the house and destroy the portrait. But even as I sit here, miles away, I can feel those eyes watching me. And sometimes, when the hotel settles in the night, I hear the faint sound of small footsteps passing by my door. I know now that whatever connection was established when I first found that portrait, it can't be broken simply by distance. And I'm starting to wonder, was it really chance that led me to discover it in the attic? Or had it been waiting for me all along, patient as only the truly timeless can be? The walls in this building are too thin to hide secrets, yet too thick to let you escape. That's what I discovered during my first week in apartment 7B, the corner studio on the top floor of the Blackwood. Built in 1932, the building wears its age like a badge of honor. Creaking floorboards, temperamental plumbing, and the distinct smell of history embedded in its walls. But it was affordable on my graduate student budget, and the panoramic view of the city from the small wrought iron balcony seemed worth the compromise. I didn't know then that the view came with unwanted spectators. It started on my third night. A soft rustling sound pulled me from sleep at 3:17 a.m. My eyes snapped open as muffled laughter drifted through the partially open balcony door. A deep chuckle followed by what sounded like a woman's whispered response. My heart rate accelerated instantly. I lived alone, 7 stories up, with no accessible neighboring balconies. I lay frozen, sweat beading on my forehead as I strained to hear more. The whispers continued, now barely audible, but unmistakably present. 2 people, maybe 3, seemed to be engaged in an intimate conversation just outside my apartment. When I finally gathered the courage to investigate, my legs trembled beneath me as I approached the balcony door. The cold metal handle sent a shock through my system. Taking a deep breath, I yanked it open and lurched forward. Nothing. The balcony stood empty under the pale moonlight. The night air hung still and silent around me, not even a breeze to explain the sounds I'd heard. I checked every corner, peered over the railing, and even examined the exterior walls. No ledges where someone could hide, no maintenance platforms, nothing but a 7-story drop to the pavement below. I told myself it must have been noise from another apartment, perhaps carried upward by some acoustic quirk of the building's architecture. I closed the door tightly, double-checked the lock, and returned to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. The pattern repeated the following night and the next. Always between 3 on and 3:30 a.m. Always whispers and occasional laughter. Always nothing when I checked. My mind began cycling through increasingly desperate explanations, neighboring apartments, street noise, dreams, bleeding into wakefulness. None satisfied the evidence of my senses. By the second week, the voices became clearer. I could almost make out words amidst the hushed tones. They spoke in a rhythmic cadence that sounded both familiar and foreign, like a language I should understand, but couldn't quite grasp. The property manager dismissed my concerns, explaining that old buildings make strange noises as they settle. His dismissive tone suggested this wasn't the first complaint about nocturnal disturbances. I began recording the sounds. The first few attempts captured nothing but static, but on the seventh night, the recorder picked up what sounded like a fragment of conversation. Not yet ready, still watching, patience. The words were distinct, yet somehow distant, as if spoken through water. My sleep deteriorated. Dark circles formed under my eyes as exhaustion became my constant companion. My academic performance suffered as concentration became impossible. Paranoia crept in around the edges of my consciousness. Was someone playing an elaborate prank? Was I being monitored? Were the whispers meant for me? I installed a motion-activated camera facing the balcony. Night after night, it recorded nothing, despite the voices becoming increasingly animated. In the recordings, the balcony remained empty, while the whispers continued unabated in the background. My own image appeared occasionally as I rushed out to investigate, my face pale and drawn, eyes wild with fear and exhaustion. The voices began speaking about me. They mentioned details of my day, commenting on the blue shirt I'd worn to class, the coffee shop where I'd studied, the phone conversation I'd had with my mother. My skin crawled with the realization that whatever or whoever these entities were, they had been following me. Last night marked a turning point. The whispers woke me as usual, but something felt different. The voices sounded excited, almost eager. My dry throat clicked as I swallowed, and my heart pounded so loudly I was certain they could hear it. The familiar phrase, "He's listening," floated through the darkness, followed by complete silence. When I checked the balcony, I found something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A small puddle of water in the exact center of the concrete floor. As I stared at it, uncomprehending, the water began to move, forming into tiny rivulets that spelled out, "Join us." I backed away, tripping over the threshold and slamming the door shut. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in the bathtub, as far from the balcony as possible. This morning, I gave notice to my landlord. He didn't seem surprised, merely nodding as he accepted my keys. As I turned to leave, he grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for such an elderly man. He leaned close and whispered that apartment 7B has always been a temporary residence. Some tenants stay weeks, others months, but eventually they all join the others. I'm writing this from a motel 20 miles away, but I can still hear them. The whispers follow me even here. And when I glance at the mirror, I notice my reflection sometimes lingers a moment too long when I turn away, its lips moving silently, forming words I can't quite understand. Not yet. The reflection appeared 3 days after Emma brought home that antique mirror from the downtown thrift store. A shadow at first, just a dark smudge behind her shoulder that disappeared when I blinked. But it was there the next morning too, more defined now. A figure wearing a wide-brimmed hat, standing perfectly still. I never mentioned it to Emma. She was so proud of her find, an ornate Victorian piece with an elaborately carved wooden frame that she'd scored for just $40. It had that tarnished, speckled look of genuinely old glass, the kind they don't make anymore. When I asked where she'd put it, she'd smiled and said, "Our bedroom needed a touch of character." That first week, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, some quirk of the ancient bubbled glass, or maybe a reflection from the window behind us. But the figure never moved, and it was always wearing that hat. By the second week, I started avoiding the mirror. My heart would pound when I had to pass it to reach the bathroom. Mornings became a carefully choreographed dance to brush my teeth without glancing at my reflection. I'd shuffle sideways past it, my peripheral vision prickling with awareness. Emma noticed my behavior, asking if I was feeling well. I muttered something about work stress. The third week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The hat had moved. No longer at the edge of the mirror, it now hovered just behind where Emma's shoulder would be when she stood to apply her makeup. The figure remained motionless, but its presence had become unmistakable. A man in an old-fashioned suit, with a face perpetually cast in shadow beneath that wide-brimmed hat. My sleep deteriorated. Night after night, I'd jolt awake, sweat-soaked, and certain I'd heard footsteps in our room. The mirror loomed in the darkness, and though I couldn't see clearly, I felt observed. My throat would constrict, my limbs leaden with dread. I'd lie there, barely breathing, until dawn filtered through the curtains. Emma started commenting on my appearance, the dark circles, my jumpiness, how I'd flinch whenever she approached me from behind. When she asked if I wanted to see someone, I almost laughed. What would I say? That her bargain mirror was haunted? Instead, I began researching the mirror's origins while she was at work. The shop owner couldn't tell me much, just that it had come from an estate sale in Millfield, a small town about 30 miles north. The previous owner had been an elderly woman who died alone. No family had claimed her belongings. I drove to Millfield that Friday, my hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. The local historical society yielded nothing until I showed a photo of the mirror to an elderly volunteer. Her face blanched. She asked how I'd come to possess Herbert Blackwood's mirror. The story spilled out in hushed tones. Herbert Blackwood, a prominent businessman in the 1920s, had been obsessed with the occult. When his wife disappeared, rumors circulated that he'd used the mirror in some dark ritual to bring her back. He was found dead in front of it months later, not murdered, not suicide, just sitting there, staring, his body withered as though he'd stopped eating or drinking altogether. That night, I confronted Emma about the mirror. She listened with growing concern as I described the figure, the hat, its gradual approach. When I mentioned Blackwood's name, her eyes widened. She admitted she'd been having nightmares of a man watching her sleep, his face hidden beneath a hat, whispering that he'd found her at last. We agreed to get rid of it, but when we returned to the bedroom, my blood turned to ice. The figure stood dead center in the mirror now, no longer a distant presence, but fully formed. And though I still couldn't see his face beneath that hat, I sensed he was smiling. Emma moved toward the mirror, transfixed. Her hand reached out to touch the glass. I lunged forward, grabbing her wrist, pulling her back. The air in the room grew dense, hard to breathe. The lamp flickered, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. We spent that night at a hotel. In the morning, we returned with a friend who worked in demolition. He wrapped the mirror in thick blankets, refusing to look at it when we explained our fears. He promised to break it into pieces and dispose of it in separate locations. That should have been the end. But sometimes, catching my reflection in a window or a puddle after rain, I see a shape behind me, distant again, but patient. Emma claims she feels someone watching when she's alone. We've moved twice since then, but it doesn't matter. When you've been marked by something from the other side, distance is meaningless. And sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear the soft sound of footsteps and feel the weight of something being placed gently on my head, the phantom pressure of a wide-brimmed hat.